She survived the death of her parents, she escaped a kidnapper's cage when she was just 13, she built a perfect life from the ashes of trauma, but none of that saved Crystal McDowell from what came next. On the morning Hurricane Harvey slammed into Texas, Crystal vanished, without a trace. No screams. No witnesses. No struggle. At first, they blamed the flood, but when the waters receded, what they uncovered wasn't a tragedy of nature, it was something much colder, much darker, and far more deliberate, because Crystal wasn't lost to the storm, she was buried by the man who once promised to protect her, and the way he did it was almost perfect, until one camera, one child, and one fatal mistake blew his secret wide open. This is the story of Crystal McDowell, and the storm that didn't kill her, but helped cover her murder.
Welcome to Dark Chronicles, where shadows hide the truth.
It started with a storm. But not the kind you'd expect. On August 25, 2017, as Hurricane Harvey crept toward the Texas coastline, most residents were preparing for disaster in the form of rising waters. But for one woman, Crystal McDowell, the true threat wasn't the weather. It was something far closer. Something far more personal. Crystal was a mother of two. A respected real estate agent in Baytown, Texas. And, on the surface, she had it all: beauty, success, a fresh start after a recent divorce. She was building a new chapter, falling in love again, and holding on to the hope of peace after a life filled with turbulence. But on the morning of August 25th, Crystal vanished. Just like that. Gone. At first, the timing seemed tragically unlucky. A massive hurricane was bearing down on the city. Floods were everywhere. Communications were down. Missing persons reports were piling up. But as the days wore on, it became harder and harder to believe that Crystal had simply disappeared into the chaos of nature. Something didn't add up. Something felt off. Let's go back. Crystal was born in 1979 in Baytown. Her childhood was a storm of its own, both parents battling addiction, and by the time she was just 11, they were gone. Dead. That alone would be enough to unravel most people. But Crystal kept going. Until 2 years later, life threw her into another nightmare. She was kidnapped. Held captive, assaulted, and locked inside a chicken coop. And yet, she escaped. That's who Crystal was. She survived. She was taken in by her aunt and uncle, people who gave her the closest thing she had to stability. And she clung to it. She worked hard. She graduated. Became a flight attendant. Traveled the world. Then, she met Steve McDowell. To her, he was a breath of fresh air. Charming. Playful. Someone who made her laugh again. Someone who reminded her what happiness might feel like. They married in 2007. 2 children followed, Madden and Maui, and with them, came what seemed like the life Crystal had always dreamed of. But social media photos don't always tell the truth. Behind the smiling faces, there was something darker. Jealousy. Control. Secrets. Crystal had affairs during her travels. And Steve, growing increasingly paranoid and possessive, spiraled. Their fights escalated. In 2008, Crystal filed for divorce, just 1 year after their wedding. But Steve threatened to end his life if she left. And so, Crystal stayed. Another cycle. Another pattern. Fast forward to 2017. 10 years of a fragile marriage later, Crystal had had enough. She finally filed for divorce, again. This time, it went through. But even after the separation, the two remained oddly entangled. She helped Steve buy a house. Even lived with him temporarily, just to help the kids transition. It was unconventional. But Crystal always put her children first. She wanted peace. She wanted to keep things civil. But Steve, he wasn't ready to let go. He kept wearing his wedding ring. He acted like she'd come back. Like the divorce didn't count, and then came Paul. Crystal met Paul Hargrave, a local jeweler, and everything changed. For the first time in years, she felt free. She felt loved. And she wanted more. She made plans to move in with Paul. She even invited him on a family cruise, a trip that had originally included Steve. When Paul declined, Crystal uninvited Steve. What she didn't know was that Steve had been planning to propose to her on that cruise. A final, desperate move to reclaim what he thought was his. And now, the man who couldn't accept losing her, had lost her completely. On the morning of August 25th, Crystal left Paul's home around 7:10 a.m. She told him she was going to Steve's house to pick up the kids and wait out the storm. Security cameras showed her leaving, purse and shoes in hand, wearing a long dark dress. And then, she vanished. Hours passed. She missed 2 real estate appointments. Her phone went silent. At first, no one panicked. Harvey was wreaking havoc. Communications were failing. But by the next morning, her Uncle Jeff knew something was wrong. Crystal was always in touch. Always calling, texting, checking in, and now nothing. But even as her family grew frantic, local police were overwhelmed. Floodwaters were swallowing entire neighborhoods. Emergency calls were non-stop. Resources were stretched thin. And Crystal McDowell, just one missing person among many, wasn't a top priority. Still, the investigation began. Police started digging into her life. They spoke to friends, co-workers, family, and, most importantly, the 2 men in her life, Steve and Paul. Here's where it gets strange. Neither man had reported Crystal missing. Both failed polygraph tests. Both gave accounts that didn't quite line up with the evidence. And both had their own dark secrets. Paul cooperated at first. Let police search his house. Handed over phone records. But then he made a curious move. He gave surveillance footage of Crystal to the news, before giving it to the police. Not just that, one of the clips had the wrong date. It looked like it was from a week earlier. Investigators started wondering, was Paul hiding something? Then his ex came forward. She handed police recordings. In them, Paul made threats. Talked about kidnapping her future child, just to make her suffer. The perfect boyfriend image started to crack. But if Paul looked suspicious, Steve looked worse. He told police Crystal never came to his house that day. But their daughter, Maui, said otherwise. She remembered hugging her mom. Remembered seeing her. Remembered her being there. That contradiction. It opened the door, and then came the car. 4 days after Crystal disappeared, a black Mercedes was found in the parking lot of a flooded Motel 6, partially submerged in muddy water. It was Crystal's car. Unlocked. Keys still in the ignition. No sign of forced entry. No obvious damage. But one thing was clear, this wasn't an accident. Someone had left that car there, hoping, maybe, it would float away with the rest of the storm's wreckage. Surveillance footage from nearby businesses quickly became the linchpin of the investigation. One clip showed Crystal's car being parked at the motel at 6:30 a.m. on August 26, 1 day after she vanished. A man was seen leaving the car. Grainy video. Low quality. But enough to raise eyebrows. He looked like Steve McDowell. And soon, police had more. 5 hours later, at a gas station across the street, clearer footage showed Steve again. He wasn't pumping gas. He wasn't even buying anything. Instead, he was seen tossing items into a trash can and walking away in the direction of the motel. What was he checking on? And more importantly, what was he throwing away? Police wanted to search that trash. But by the time they got there, Harvey had already erased everything. The floodwaters had swept the bin clean. The physical evidence gone, but that didn't stop investigators. They scoured other footage. Walmart. Parking lots. Street corners. And the puzzle began to form. One piece stood out, Steve buying a bicycle at a nearby store the same morning Crystal's car was abandoned. Later that day, a camera picked up a man on a bike, heading away from the motel. It looked like Steve. The theory? Steve drove Crystal's car to the motel, ditched it, and pedaled home. Still, it wasn't enough to make an arrest. There was no body. No confession. Just a web of circumstantial evidence. Investigators needed a breakthrough, and they got one. In the form of leverage, they worked with Child Protective Services to remove Crystal's 2 children from Steve's custody. It was a move Steve hadn't expected. And on September 9th, just 2 weeks after Crystal vanished, he broke. Steve confessed. He told police that yes, Crystal had come to his house that morning. Yes, they argued. About the divorce. About her new boyfriend. About the fact that she was really leaving him. And in a moment of rage, he snapped. He strangled her. As their children slept in nearby rooms. He wrapped her in garbage bags. Loaded her into the trunk of her own car. Drove to a wooded area. Dumped the body. Then took the car to the motel, parked it, and rode the bike home, all of it, premeditated. Cold. Calculated. And completely hidden by the chaos of a natural disaster, Steve led police to the location of her remains. The body of Crystal McDowell had been lying there for nearly 2 weeks. Her life stolen. Her voice silenced. Her story buried in the mud. Steve McDowell was arrested and charged with first-degree murder. But the trial wouldn't begin for another 2 years. In that time, he changed his story. When it finally came time to face a jury, Steve presented a shocking new version of events. He claimed that Crystal had come to his house that morning. They'd had sex. And in a moment of passion, as he hugged her, he accidentally squeezed too hard. He didn't strangle her in anger, he said. He just hugged her to death. His defense team framed it as a crime of sudden passion. Under Texas law, that's a key distinction. If the jury believed him, it could mean a reduced sentence, as little as 2 years. They even tried to tarnish Crystal's image, reading graphic text messages she'd sent to lovers during her marriage, as if her infidelity somehow justified her death. But the prosecution had something Steve didn't expect: a witness. A powerful one, his own daughter. 7-year-old Maui took the stand and testified. She told the courtroom what she'd seen with her own eyes. She described her father pinning Crystal down, hitting her, holding her down with violent force. She described her mother turning her head and looking at her, eyes wide, full of fear. And then, silence. Steve saw his daughter. And instead of stopping, instead of protecting her from the horror, he told her to go back to her room. To forget what she saw. To keep the secret. Her testimony devastated the courtroom. It tore down Steve's final defense. The jury didn't buy the passionate hug story. They didn't buy the accident. Or the confusion. They saw what this was: deliberate. Violent and unrelenting. After just 3.5 hours of deliberation, the jury returned a verdict: guilty. Steve McDowell was sentenced to 50 years in prison. Under Texas law, he'll be eligible for parole in 2042, after serving 25 years. For Crystal's family, that means a quarter-century of peace. But it also means a countdown. A reminder that, one day, the man who killed her might walk free again. The case of Crystal McDowell is one of storms, both literal and emotional. She survived things most people never could. The death of her parents. Childhood trauma. Abuse. She rebuilt her life. She found success. She found love. But in the end, it wasn't nature that took her. It wasn't Hurricane Harvey. It was something far more tragic. It was the man who once swore to love her. The verdict was in. Steve McDowell, husband, father, killer, was found guilty of murdering Crystal McDowell. A 50-year sentence. But even as the courtroom cleared, the real story was far from over, because this wasn't just a murder trial. This was a story about control, about obsession, and about what happens when love curdles into something darker. For Crystal's family, the sentence brought a degree of closure. But no one called it justice. Not really. Not when the man who took her life could be eligible for parole in just 25 years. Not when their daughter had to relive the horror on a witness stand. Not when her 2 children would grow up without a mother, and then, possibly, one day, face the return of the man who took her away. And for many, that possibility is hard to accept, because Crystal's murder wasn't spontaneous. It wasn't heat-of-the-moment passion. It was a slow-burn tragedy that everyone around her had started to feel but couldn't stop. Her family had noticed Steve's behavior long before that final morning. His possessiveness. His jealousy. His quiet refusal to accept reality. They'd seen it in his words. In his eyes. Even in his ring finger, still clinging to the band long after Crystal had taken hers off, and while the defense tried to paint Crystal as reckless. Unfaithful, impulsive, the truth was, none of that mattered. Because no text message, no affair, no new relationship justifies murder. In the aftermath of the trial, the media revisited Crystal's case with new eyes. National programs highlighted the strange timing of her disappearance. The eerie way Hurricane Harvey had become the backdrop for a deadly act. Reporters questioned how many other crimes had been hidden beneath the storm's waters, how many tragedies had been delayed, obscured, or ignored because nature stole the spotlight, and then, the public focused on something else, the investigation itself. Baytown police had faced massive challenges. Flooded streets. Scattered priorities. A media circus. Yet somehow, they had pushed through. Pulled evidence from drowned surveillance systems. Tracked a suspect through washed-out neighborhoods. And ultimately, secured a confession. Still, many questioned why it had taken so long. Why had Crystal's children remained with Steve for days after her disappearance? Why weren't red flags acted upon sooner? Why did it take the removal of the children to force a confession? It raised uncomfortable questions about law enforcement's ability to protect victims during times of crisis, and whether more proactive intervention could have saved Crystal's life. But beyond the legal and procedural fallout, there was a quieter story unfolding. A story of grief. Crystal's loved ones had to pick up the pieces. Her aunt and uncle, who had raised her like their own, found themselves parenting all over again, this time, with Crystal's kids. Her friends, once the cheering squad behind her booming real estate career, now became the guardians of her memory, and Maui and Madden, their lives would never be the same. The trauma they carried wasn't theoretical. It was real. Maui had testified in court, yes, but what about the nights afterward? What about the birthday parties Crystal would never attend? The school milestones she would never celebrate? The family photos forever missing a piece. Paul Hargrave, Crystal's boyfriend at the time, remained mostly silent after the trial. Though he was initially scrutinized during the early stages of the investigation, he was never charged with any crime. His image, however, never fully recovered. The security video confusion. The unsettling claims from his ex. It all left a cloud. Not of guilt, but of unanswered questions. And in the world of true crime, ambiguity sticks like blood on the wall. Still, the case had its lessons. One of the biggest. How abusers often hide in plain sight. To outsiders, Steve McDowell looked harmless. Kind, even. He was the man Crystal once called the love of her life. The father of her children. The one who made her laugh, made her feel seen. But somewhere along the way, love turned into control. Affection became surveillance. Protection became possession, and Crystal saw it. She knew, she told her friends, if Steve finds out about Paul, he'll kill me. She said it casually. But beneath the surface, there was real fear. Because deep down, she understood what he was capable of, and she was right, in a moment where she should have been safest, in the home she had once shared with the father of her children, she was ambushed. Strangled. Disposed of like a problem instead of a person. Crystal's case also sparked broader discussions about domestic violence. How often do we miss the signs? How often do victims try to keep things peaceful for the sake of the kids? Only to put themselves in even more danger. How often do friends and family dismiss subtle warnings, until it's too late? Advocacy groups began referencing Crystal's story in training materials. Law enforcement seminars cited the case when discussing how to approach missing person reports during natural disasters. Podcasts, YouTube channels, and documentaries dissected every angle, showing how a storm both concealed and revealed a brutal crime, and while the public continued debating the details, one fact remained inescapable: Crystal McDowell was dead. Not because of a storm. Not because of an accident. But because of a man who couldn't let go. Today, her memory lives on in her children, in her friends, in the photos she posted online, in the clients who remember her as the smiling realtor who could light up a room. But more than anything, her story is a warning, a reminder that the greatest threats don't always come from outside. Sometimes, they're waiting behind your own front door. In the years since the verdict, the legacy of Crystal McDowell continues to evolve, shaped by both heartbreak and resilience. Her story has been featured in true crime documentaries, news specials, and podcasts across the country. Not because she was famous, but because her death revealed a truth we often overlook, that sometimes, the people we fear the least can do the most damage. Steve McDowell may be behind bars, but the shadow of his actions still lingers. For every survivor of domestic violence, Crystal's story feels eerily familiar. The charming abuser, the escalating control, the hope that things might change. And then, suddenly, they don't. What makes her case even more chilling is how close she came to escaping. She had rebuilt her life, had a new love, a new career, a plan for the future. And still, it wasn't enough. Her murder didn't happen in the middle of a bitter custody battle. It didn't happen during a violent public breakdown. It happened during what many believed was a peaceful post-divorce transition. Crystal had even gone out of her way to help Steve, buying him a house, letting him spend time with the kids, staying civil for the sake of co-parenting. But for a man like Steve, that civility was misread. Not as closure, but as possibility. He thought she'd come back. He convinced himself that she should, and when she didn't, when Crystal chose freedom over familiarity, he snapped. That morning, Crystal showed up to Steve's house expecting to co-parent, to protect her children, to make it through a hurricane. Instead, she was killed in cold blood, strangled by someone who once promised to love her forever. What makes this story even more haunting is the role Hurricane Harvey played, not as the cause, but as the camouflage. A Category 4 storm, historic flooding, emergency responders stretched to their limit. If Steve hadn't confessed, if Crystal's family hadn't pushed, this case might have been buried with the storm. That's the frightening part, how close he came to getting away with it, how the timing, the conditions, and the chaos almost allowed him to vanish her, without a trace. But Crystal's family refused to let her disappear. Her aunt and uncle, who once saved her from a childhood of instability, did it again. They raised their voices. They fought through the media. They demanded justice. Her friends refused to be silent. Her children, especially Maui, showed a bravery beyond their years, and so, despite everything, Crystal was found. Her voice heard. Her truth exposed. Today, the home where she died is no longer a crime scene. It's a reminder that behind closed doors, behind picture-perfect lives, danger can still grow in silence. That sometimes, the signs are quiet, until they aren't. That when someone tells you they're afraid, you believe them. And that if someone says he'll kill me if he finds out, we no longer assume they're exaggerating, because Crystal wasn't. She was right, and now, every time we tell her story, we keep others safer. We remind people that storms don't just come from the sky. That love should never cost your life. And that silence can be the most dangerous weapon of all. Rest in peace, Crystal McDowell, we remember you.
So, that's how crimes end, and if you like this episode, don't forget to like and subscribe and turn on the notifications. If you want me to do some special crimes in all over the world, comment down below, or you can send us direct through email, and I will see you in all my videos. See ya!